Okay, hopefully everybody can see that. As Daniela said, I am a researcher, but with my roots very much firmly in teaching. My discipline is business and management. And as a teacher of business and management, I have been involved for many, many years in the teaching of very large undergraduate classes in that subject. And what first got me interested in researching assessment is because of those very large classes, to find out what it was that worked for students and what sort of understandings they had and how they could improve their learning. So, as I say, I'm a researcher, but very much with my roots in the practice of teaching. So, if we're going to consider assessment standards this morning, we need to think about why that's important. And they're important particularly for three groups of people. Obviously, institutions are concerned about the quality of the assessment of the students, because those students go out into the world with an award that has got to be of the right quality to maintain the reputation of those institutions as being rigorous and high quality. For students, obviously, I'm sure those of you that teach will know that students are very, very interested in the grades that they achieve. And so for students, being assured that the grading that they have for their outcomes is fair and rewards them, they are very interested to know that. And for staff, it's also a way of safeguarding our disciplines. We obviously are trained in particular disciplines and belong to those communities, and we need, I think, as a community and as individuals, to be sure that our students are going out as whatever they're, as a historian, as a chemist, whatever they are, and we're completely satisfied that they have the right quality of assessment before they go out there with that award. So it is very important, and in some countries around the world, there have been a lot of discussions around things like grade inflation and whether or not the standards are being maintained, and particularly in this country as the number of students who enter higher education has increased. But before we go on any further, I want to be clear about what I'm talking about when I'm talking about assessment standards. There's really two elements to assessment standards. The first is the academic standards that must be achieved in relation to assessment. And what I mean by academic standards, you see those in the outputs that students produce. So you see them
que producen los alumnos, se ven.
You see them in the texts that they have. Sorry, I've just got, I had a message to say that the translation's stopped. Sorry, so academic standards are output standards. So you see those in the pieces of work that you mark from students, or the performances that you give, or whatever, for whatever subject that they are doing. Whereas quality standards, and there has been a great move in higher education over the last number of years to increase what we call quality standards. These are like input standards and the processes that are put in place to try and ensure the standards or the assessment is done properly. So that might be to do with ensuring that learning outcomes are stated properly, or it might be to do with the processes of moderation of marks, for example. So what I'm going to talk about mainly today, in fact, almost exclusively today, is the notion of the academic standards. I'm not going to talk about the processes around assessment standards, but it is important to realize that quality standards cannot assure academic standards, which is why we need to focus, particularly as academics, on those academic standards. They are the things that that underpin our judgments when we are grading students' work. So, how much do we know about standards? We can maybe think about this in relation to by asking some certain questions about how confident we are about standards. So do staff really understand standards well enough to grade the students' work fairly? Do they ensure consistency with other markers? So, or are there sort of reputations in your institutions that sort of say, oh, he's a hard marker or she is not a hard marker? You often hear students talking about these things. But a really difficult question to answer is, how well can you explain the standards to the students? We might try and do that through things like feedback, but to what extent do we do that before the students actually embark on a piece of work? And if we do try and do that, how easy is it to do? Many staff find it very challenging, because sometimes you sort of don't really know what to expect until you see the students' work. It depends on the nature of the task. So, and from a student's point of view, do they understand the standards well enough to guide them in their work? If you talk to students, quite often they say they're absolutely in the dark. They really don't understand what it is that they're aiming for. So is it about expectations of the staff? Can they say clearly what they're expecting? And how consistent are we in terms of, if we were to grade a piece of work in, say, September, would we still give it the same grade if we graded it in January or even a week later? How much do things influence us that we're unaware of? The other thing around higher education, of course, and assessment standards is the open-ended nature of the tasks, or the type of tasks that we will set students. They're not generally tasks with right and wrong answers. They're tasks that allow students to show their understandings and take the subject in interesting places. So it's quite difficult to really explain the standards beforehand, but we do know that our disciplines all have particular standards that we ought to be trying to inculcate into the work, or get students to inculcate into their own work before they graduate. So what's the evidence about whether we are fair or whether we are consistent? And I hate to tell you this, you might know it already, but you can see there's a long list of pieces of work there. And the research almost universally shows, in fact, we haven't found a piece of work that contradicts this. They show that we are not very consistent. We don't, we think we might mark the same standards as colleagues, but we don't. We don't even necessarily mark consistently against each for individually. So as I say, from September to January. So it's very difficult to claim that we are fair. There's always considerable discrepancy in the grades according to the same or a similar assignment that we will give to a piece of work. So let's think about what the problems are and why at the moment we have this problem and we aren't consistent. And I'm going to take you on a journey, partly a personal journey that I undertook but also showing how things have developed and are developing in relation to standards in the sector. And in order to do that, I am going to use a matrix. It's a matrix that me and my colleagues developed when we were thinking about how students come to understand standards. And I will bring it back to how we as staff become to understand standards as we go through. So this matrix that I'm going to use, you can see it has 4 quadrants, and the horizontal axis on the left-hand side, there are formal activities and inputs that are carried out. And on the other side, all the activities and inputs are informal, so they're not managed. And as I said, this matrix was devised to look at students. But so at the top of the vertical axis, you've got active student engagement. The students are doing something with the standards. And at the bottom, it's very difficult to know whether you can have passive engagement, but here the students are just given things, it's passive. And as I go through these quadrants, I'm going to be tracking the past to the future. So the first quadrant is the bottom right-hand corner, and that's called the traditional model. And that's how higher education used to be for many, many, many years, and it may still be like this in some places, although the shift across globally to increase the input of quality standards means that this is rarely the case anymore. It tended to be that assessment standards really weren't talked about. Students came to understand those standards in a sort of serendipitous sort of way. So in other words, just through their learning, their discussion in tutorials, for example, they may or may not have quickly or not so quickly worked out what it was that they were required to do. You can see in the wording here, we're talking about tacit knowledge of standards that are absorbed over a relatively long time, and they're informal and it's serendipitous. Now, why am I talking about tacit knowledge? Let me just explain that knowledge is, there are 2 types of knowledge. There is explicit knowledge that we can easily articulate, and there is tacit knowledge. And knowing our standards, we tend to use a lot of tacit knowledge. And it's something that you know that you cannot easily put into words. Polanyi, who wrote a lot about this, says, we know more than we can tell. So it's often difficult if a student sort of says to you, well, what do I need to achieve here? It's very difficult to tell them what it is that you're looking for. And it's not just in our profession, it's in most professions, almost all professions, that it's fundamental to the expertise and judging that is done in those professions. So for example, in law, in medicine even, that there is a lot of tacit knowledge that is used. And we tend to use this in our profession when we are judging students' work. So bear in mind that there are 2 types of knowledge, but the tacit knowledge is the knowledge that's quite difficult to share. There are ways to do it. Those of you that know about community of practice writing will do that. The second quadrant, so we've moved away from informal activities and inputs to formal activities and inputs, and you will find something called the dominant logic explicit model. Now, in most countries around the world these days, there is a move towards making standards explicit. So things like writing learning outcomes, things like selecting criteria, writing level descriptors, and these are done with the best possible motive to make those standards as clear as possible to the students so that they can go about their learning aiming at the right sort of standard. As I say, it's become very dominant. It's been very popular. The only problem is with it, it's becoming clear that it doesn't work. It might be a starting point for academics and students to discuss what it is that's required, but there are distinct problems with it. So we can see that the interpretation of keywords and phrases which are written within things like learning outcomes or criteria or level descriptors or other things that are similar, if assessors apply different interpretations of those words, then those explicit descriptions don't lead to consistency. It's also true that written specifications have been shown that they cannot be applied mechanistically, that actually we always come back to using judgment. And if you remember, judgment is often based on tacit knowledge. And you might think, well, okay, we can do something about that. We can expand the descriptions that we give, but actually greater precision is inherently self-defeating. If you were to write something in enough detail for a criterion to be really understood, it would lose its utility. We would have reams and reams and reams of descriptions, and they would not be very useful. So there are real problems with this notion that we can make standards explicit. And that's because of the nature of standards. Sadler, who some of you may have seen earlier in one of the panel sessions of this conference, talked about standards they cannot be conceptualized as having an existence or relevance separate from the context of the teaching team, the course as it was taught, and its current students. So in other words, they're not fixed entities that can be plucked from outside and brought in. They are things that are living, if you like, and open to discussion. So they don't exist independently, and they develop their meaning in use and through our social involvement in academic and professional communities. I mentioned at the beginning of this talk that we are concerned, of course, about our discipline, and our discipline have communities, and so those communities are interested in maintaining the standards of their discipline. But that doesn't mean to say that those standards remain written in stone. So the important message here is that standards are socially constructed. Some people don't like this idea, but it seems to be the case. The evidence seems to point to the fact that standards are used and debated socially, and that's how they are defined. So that is important when we're thinking about how we come to understand standards and how the students come to understand standards. Now, here, this is where I will tell you a little bit about a personal story. In the 90s, I and my colleagues really bought the idea of this dominant logic explicit model. For the business school, we developed a whole grid of criteria with level descriptors for each of the grades. And we asked the staff to use those with their students. They selected the criteria they wanted to use, and they made grids for each individual assessment task that they were using. And then we interviewed them to ask them how useful it was. And those interviews were very interesting. We asked them if they found them useful. Absolutely, yes. Particularly if you wanted to explain to students what it is they were supposed to be aiming for, and particularly on feedback to justify grades that were being awarded. But then we said to them, okay, which modules are you using these criteria and level descriptors on? And the level descriptors had been written for second year undergraduate. But the staff were using the exact same criteria and level descriptors for postgraduate and foundation as well, with no change whatsoever. And yet they found them useful, which told us something about the fact that in the context in which they were being used, there was a sort of translation in terms of the interpretation that the staff were putting on the words in those criteria grids. And that made us think about how people come to understand standards. And so we set about thinking about how students could best come to understand the standards. And we moved up into this quadrant up here, knowing that the students needed to actively engage with the criteria, with the level descriptors, in order to even begin to understand them. And we set up a research project, I won't go into the details of it, whereby the students were asked to use the criteria to grade some exemplars. We then invited them to, and we gathered the data about that. We invited them to come to workshops to discuss those criteria and the gradings. And then they were asked, and they did a piece of work similar to the piece of work that they had looked at. And two interesting things came out of that. One is that those students that came to the workshops got, on average, and we had control groups and all sorts of things to check this, got 6 percentage marks more than the other students that had only received the grids but hadn't taken part in the workshop and the discussions. And to follow that through, a year later, we looked at the same students and a similar type assignment, and those students were still doing 4% better. Obviously, we had controlled for the type of students that they were, what their backgrounds, etc. So this seemed to be something that made a difference. It seemed to be something that you needed to actively engage with the assessment standards, and you needed to have that conversation with the staff to find out how they were understanding the standards. And so between students and staff, there was a social construction of what the standards were in the particular business course. By the way, the students that the year later, there hadn't been any further input, there hadn't been any further workshops, etc., to make a difference. So those students that benefited from the workshops took it forward into other modules and used it. So we were pretty convinced about all this. And as you can see, we have got one more quadrant. And that moved us to thinking about a cultivated community of practice. So in other words, it's really important for there to be a community of practice which can then help to share some of the tacit knowledge in that community. And tacit knowledge is shared through observation, through imitation, and sort of activity within the community. So things like the use of exemplars, where students can actually see the standards that are important to you, and also having occasional sort of discussions around criteria and level descriptors seem to be important. So, but remember, we're talking here on the informal activities side of the matrix. And so you may need to not only have the informal, but but also think about some more formal activities for students. So why is community important? Because assessment judgments rely on local and contextualized interpretations of quality, and they're underpinned by this tacit knowledge of quality. And because often students are kept in the dark, they're not involved in community, somehow it's seen as a test for students to work out what the standards are. They don't really understand what's being asked of them. And so even though they're given standards and criteria and level descriptors, they often don't use them because they don't really understand what they are about. So community is really important. Your disciplinary communities are really important to try and support everybody in that sharing of tacit knowledge. But okay, so we've thought about the students, but of course all this assumes that the staff have a robust and consistent understanding of the standards that they are going to be using. And so if you think about how staff come to understand standards, it tends to be on a fairly informal basis. New academics join faculty. They don't necessarily have long conversations about the standards that are used in marking. We have conferences, we have research conferences, we have teaching and learning conferences, but we don't very often have conversations about standards or share examples of student work that we've marked and look at how our colleagues would have marked that work and compare it and talk about why we made those judgments. We do sometimes, particularly around dissertations. That's more common to have those discussions around why two markers have reached their decisions. But generally speaking, we don't have general conversations about that. And so more recently, I have been working on a project called the Degree Standards Project in the UK that has been thinking about how communities actually can share the standards that they use with each other and become more confident that the standards that they are using, not only within their local teams, but actually nationally, are more consistent with each other. And the reason I've got both these quadrants highlighted is that to a certain extent, we think there needs to be some formal inputs or support for the communities. So what we're aiming for is something called calibration, which sounds, some people really don't like the term. It sounds a bit harsh. But calibration is about sharing knowledge of standards. And it's often achieved through social moderation processes. So in other words, coming together and deciding what grade something should be and having that discussion. But the ideal would be to create calibrated academics. And Sadler again has written about calibrated academics. And if you could become a calibrated academic, you wouldn't need to constantly compare your judgments with colleagues. You would have engaged in enough moderation over time to feel that you are making the same or consistent judgments with your colleagues. I think one of the things that's clear is you can't just become a calibrated academic and then walk away. It is something that has to be constantly supported, but maybe not as often as when you were in your early career stages as an academic. But if you think back to when you were an early career academic, how much support were you actually given in terms of what sort of standards you should mark? Or was there an assumption that because we're part of these disciplines, we all know the standards that we should be using? You may be interested to know that the calibration workshop or the approach to calibration that this degree standards project has adopted is we ask academics in a particular discipline who have volunteered to participate in this to actually mark some examples of work. They then load the marks up anonymously or de-identified onto a shared portal so that others can see the range of marks that have been given. Then we bring them together in a workshop and they work in small groups to consider the differences between their judgments and why those differences exist. And I think the important thing to emphasize here is we're not really saying to them, you've got to agree the same grade, although of course, hopefully that comes out of it, but we want you to explore the standards that you're using, because it is quite possible, and there is quite a lot of evidence that you can reach the same grade, but have a different emphasis on different standards in your judgments. And so in these workshops, they have quite long discussions around these exemplars. And it's important that exemplars are used because remember what I said about assessments, academic standards appear in the outputs from students. And so you need, in order to make these standards material or real, you have to be able to use examples from student work in order to illustrate what it is that you're looking for in that work. In other words, what it is that you value. And so in these workshops, at the end, there is a set of items, and they're illustrated by extracts from the exemplars they've used of things that are highly valued in that piece of work, and they have been agreed across the wide group of people. Needless to say, that is not sufficient. That sort of process is not sufficient to make a calibrated academic. And the disciplines then will come together on subsequent occasions, look at different types of assessments, have different conversations with different colleagues. But it's all working towards this idea of, as the colleagues participate, they become more calibrated and move towards greater consistency. And so if we are going to be fair in the assessments that we make of student work, so that we award the appropriate grades, that we are confident that we are consistent with colleagues. So if a different colleague marked the same piece of work, it would be a similar judgment. We're never going to achieve exactly the same judgment. It will help in transparency in grading because we will be able to see quite what it is that's governing our judgments. And hopefully it will help us to develop students' understanding of standards to support their learning. And I would say, so fairness in assessment standards is going to be achieved through calibration of staff and the assessment literacy of students. This term assessment literacy is around the whole idea about giving students discussing exemplars with students, discussing the criteria and staff interpretation, and allowing students to self-assess and giving them feedback on self-assessment. Those sorts of things are going to support the students, but we need to get our house in order first or concurrently to ensure that the messages we're giving to the students are the messages for our discipline, not for us individually. Okay, in which case I'm going to leave it there. Hopefully that will have stimulated a number of questions. So I'll stop sharing.
Muchas gracias, Margaret, por tu interesante ponencia. Yo creo que a todos los
Thank you very much, Margaret, for your interesting talk. All of us who work in higher education now wonder how we can foster these assessment communities in which we can calibrate our assessments for the good of our students. Thank you. Let us continue. Now let me introduce the talk of Dr. Veronica Villarreal titled Learning Developments. She's a doctor of psychology, a master on psychology by the University of Chile. She's currently the director of the Research Center Sigma, and she's also an undergraduate and graduate professor of the University of Desarrollo. She focuses her research on authentic assessment and dialogical approaches of assessments as well. Welcome, Veronica. The floor is all yours.
Hola, muy buenos días, muy buenas tardes, según el horario.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on your location. Let me start sharing my screen.
Bien, espero que la voy a poner en modo presentación, que se vea bien. Bien, como planteó Daniela en la presentación, ya seguramente me han visto en otras presentaciones, particularmente en el panel 5.
Probably you remember that I had the chance to talk to you on the 5th panel, and I told you more about performance-based tasks. And I talked to you about the authentic assessment as well. And I talked to you about cognitive challenges and learning outcomes as well. Now, I would like to focus on learning outcomes as a construct, as the center of the educational process and curricular alignment. So I will be referring to some authors such as Biggs. Learning outcomes are considered to be a compass directing our work, especially when assessing the learning processes of our students. And what I'm telling you might sound very basic. It might come across as something fundamental, because when you teach either at a school or at a university, you should know that we expect students to be able to prove they have learned something after a class, after a course, or of course after they graduate. But sometimes when trying to really dig deeper, teaching planning is very subjective, and professors or teachers grant different levels of importance to planning and to the learning process. So Margaret told us about calibration and assessment communities, probably we should foster social consensus for the good of our students. One way to address this educational challenge, we need to understand what learning outcomes are and why they are considered a compass. Probably this is not new to you. Probably you will not acquire new knowledge through this talk, but I'd rather believe that we at higher education should reflect upon the importance of learning outcomes, and not only for higher education, but for primary and secondary education as well. So when we work on a curriculum for the first time, or sometimes when we are asked to modify a curriculum of a class or a course we've been teaching for a long time, we tend to ask ourselves, what do I want my students to be able to think or do by the end of the course? We know there are goals to comply with, there are learning outcomes, there are constants to teach. And of course, we can have certain suggestions on how to tackle the teaching of that class. We also wonder, how will students evolve? How will they change throughout this course? And all of these questions we make ourselves as teachers or professors might be answered by us. How am I going to do my class or to do my course? How am I going to provide context to my students? How am I going to address the different theories with my students? And these are the learning outcomes from the perspective of a teacher or professor. Teachers and professors have dreams and goals and aspirations for students within our own perspective. So we dream about what we will be doing. But when we talk about learning, we should focus ourselves on the position of our students. And students are asking themselves, what will I be able to do once I'm done with this class? How will I change after completing this course? So we should put ourselves in the shoes of our students, especially when thinking about the evidence we will need from students to prove for them, in order for them to prove they have learned. Because students will have to prove what they have learned after or throughout the completion of that unit, of that study program or course. So on the one hand, there's one learning goal which has to do with the professor's goal, and that's a teacher or professor-oriented process. But on the other hand, a learning outcome or learning goal has to be clear and transparent for the student. Students should know how much they have accomplished, how much they still have to accomplish, and they have to know the different requirements needed from them. So learning outcomes have to do with what students are capable of proving or doing, and it should be a student-focused process. If we are to define a learning outcome, well, you can find many definitions, but there's consensus over this definition. Learning outcomes are statements on what a learner is able to do after completing a learning process. In one of the panels we just had, we heard about the relevance of enabling or allowing students to prove, to make use of the knowledge they have acquired throughout the career or throughout the course, throughout a class, or throughout the study program. We know we have a hard time formulating or stating, and there are thousands of guidelines on how to write a learning outcome, how limited they should be. And we as professors have a hard time on this. And I can say it very clearly because I have had to advise professors within the School of Psychology and at other institutions as well. And professors have a hard time thinking about what students need to prove so that we can know they have learned. And sometimes it's hard for us to focus on the most important things. If we're to summarize what the literature says in regard to how how learning outcomes are stated, we should understand that they should have a teaching purpose, because students should get orientations out of learning outcomes. And very sadly, students get a curriculum at the beginning of the year or the semester, and sometimes they don't even read the program. And we as teachers or professors do the same. We just take a look at the program at the beginning of the semester and then we forget about it. And I believe that is sad and regrettable, because the curriculum is a compass. If we're to sail, we would be constantly taking a look at our compass, or rather than a compass, a GPS probably. And a curriculum is a GPS. It's a compass that should guide students. It's a strategic source of help. And a strategic professor should be constantly taking a look at the compass, namely the curriculum, so that he or she is making sure that the activities he or she is proposing are aligned with the curriculum. Learning outcomes have a teaching purpose. They should be precise, concrete, and measurable, because students are called to measure what they have learned. They need to be communicated explicitly in the curriculum. And by this, I do not mean students or professors writing down learning outcomes word per word in the classroom or in the boardroom. No, I mean students getting to know what it is expected from them by the beginning or by the after or by the end of that course. These learning outcomes are expressed in clear and precise manner, and they state what students will be able to perform once they are done with that particular course. Now let's put this very concretely. We know learning outcomes include a verb in infinitive form. These verbs need to be clear. They need to refer to possible ways to assess the work to be performed by our students. We should make sure students move forward towards something they can prove, because that's what really makes a difference. We should help our students so that they are aware about the expected learning outcomes. So these learning outcomes include a verb, an object or a content, and a context. These three elements should always be present in a learning outcome. And this is an example of a class that I teach at the School of Psychology. Deducing, or to deduce, that's the verb of action or action. The object is the learning theory, and the context is a determined pedagogical practice. And the whole goal is deducing the learning theory within the context of a determined pedagogical or teaching practice. The action or the verb is critical, and there are different ways to consider or to pick the best verbs possible. And by verbs, I mean the cognitive abilities performed or passed on by this verb, and there are different taxonomies. The Bloom taxonomy is the most classical one. And those taxonomies had focused on the verb, but the verb alone does not is not sufficient. We need to provide a clear object or content and a clear context. These three large elements are key as to passing on the messages our students need to focus on. The verb is critical because it represents how students will be able to prove they have understood or learned what was expected from them. There are many taxonomies. I would like to point out that 7 out of them have been reviewed by me and other colleagues, and we at our research center have made an eclectic decision on analyzing these taxonomies, and we have taken what we believe to be the best out of each one of them. The first one is the Bloom taxonomy, which includes 6 levels or dimensions. And Bloom focuses on subjects which are or nouns, which are knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, and assessment. And Bloom lets us know that there are different common ways to think. Then Anderson and Cradwell reviewed Bloom's taxonomies, and they divided Bloom's taxonomy into 2 dimensions, one on the type of knowledge and on the categories of knowledge. So it's an update of Bloom's taxonomy, but it's not that hard. So they talked about knowledge dimensions, and they talked about the types of knowledge. So factual knowledge, conceptual knowledge, procedural knowledge, and metacognitive knowledge. And they talked about different knowledge categories. They performed certain adjustments, and they said it explicitly that it was important to talk about verbs rather than nouns. So they talked about reminding or remembering, comprehending or understanding, applying, analyzing, assessing, and creating. And churches provide a new update on Bloom's taxonomy according to the digital era. And there's another one on the taxonomy of significant learning by Fink. And it is based on the concept of change and significant learning. He talks about 6 levels as well. He talks about fundamental knowledge, application, integration, but he also adds other dimensions which are more personal, such as self-acknowledgement, acknowledgement of others, which is a human dimension. And he also talks about a motivational learning, having to do with care. And he calls this dimension an affective or attitude related dimension. And the 6th way, or the 6th proposal by Fink, is learning how to learn. Then we find the solo taxonomy based on the acronym structure of observed learning outcomes proposed by Biggs. And he classifies learning outcomes depending on their complexity. So he talks about pre-structural, unistructural, multistructural, relational, and extended abstructural knowledge. So you have pre-structural knowledge, unistructural knowledge, which includes one single variable. And probably you have heard about Solo's taxonomy, and I don't want to spend too long talking about it. Last but not least, let me mention the Marzano and Kendall's taxonomy. They talk about mental processes in regard to how people perform mental operations, and they talk about 6 mental systems: 4 cognitive operations, and Anderson and Bloom also address this when they address retrieval, comprehension, analysis, and use. So there is a cognitive sphere and a metacognitive sphere and a self-cognitive sphere as well, according to the taxonomy by Marzano and Kendall. And last but not least, let me mention the taxonomy of ICAP: interactive, constructive, active, and passive. That's the acronym for ICAP. And these authors talk about cognitive involvement. Students become cognitively involved when addressing a task. So this model goes from least involvement to most or highest involvement. So there are different 4 modes: interactive, which has to do with dialoguing, co-creating, or innovating, and then constructive, generating, transferring, inferring; active, manipulating, applying, relating; and passive, receiving, remembering, or storing. The third mode is the active one, and you apply it when you manipulate, when you apply, or when you relate learnings. And passive has to do with receiving, remembering, or storing. Why am I showing this taxonomies? We have explained to our colleagues that learning outcomes are important to establish a roadmap indicating where we want to go and how we want to get there. And that is why we have come up with different dimensions in order to characterize this learning outcome. So one dimension has to do with the thinking process, which is at the base of this learning outcome. And we can see, or we can name Bloom and Anderson and Marzano's approaches in here. Bloom recognizes 6 different processes. Anderson recognizes 4. And Marzano also talks about 6. We're reorganizing something that has already been proposed. We're not creating anything new. We're just reorganizing. Because our goal is to help professors to create a proper curriculum. Curriculum for their courses, and also to assess or to create assessments that are of higher quality. And we summarized all of these thoughts or thinking processes into 3 ones. So we have thought about 3 different processes of thinking. Level 1, memory and recognition of information and data. and we can name some strategies dealing with memorizing or information or learning information by heart. And we can name different verbs that match this level number 1: defining, describing, naming, identifying, listing, etc. And the way some students do some study has to do with this level 1. Level number 2 has to do with analytics and knowledge management. Therefore, the cognitive ability should focus on decomposing something, summarizing something, so that we can arrive at new comprehensions on that subject. And we will find verbs like calculating, comparing, applying, analyzing, debating, using, etc. If we consider level 2, we need to assess in a more careful way. And in level number 3, we can name skills having to do with transfer and deployment of cognitive performance. And the goal is to create something new or to apply knowledge from a metacognitive point of view. So we can find verbs such as constructing, creating, designing, planning, inventing, modifying, proposing, etc. And as I was telling you, we learn in order to get to level number 3. We attend schools and we attend university so that we can reach this level number 3, because in life, cognitive performances of level 3 are needed in order to relate to other people and to do well in life.
Aprendizaje que tiene que ver con el proceso de pensamiento. Es una
Things that
dimensión.
have to do with, sometimes we only end up with those things. We have that one dimension, but we also have to see the kind of knowledge and content that we need to ask. And here we can see that Anderson and Krathwohl had talked about factual, conceptual, procedural, and metacognitive. But however, you could think the metacognitive could also be in a different level, not necessarily in the kind of knowledge, but also a process of thinking or the maturity of thought. So for us, we wanted to simplify in 3 levels and think the kind of knowledge. It's not something we made up. This is from the models of competencies. They have talked about this, and a conceptual knowledge or knowledge. And this is all linked to this model, to theories, data, etc., to know how to do and to also use that information or that knowledge related to knowing and to know that sometimes is related to those things that are more difficult for us to evaluate in higher education, that we have tried to move to the decision area as well and develop a professional criteria where all of these things and emotions are involved, but it can be something more measurable. So we have these different ways, or these 3 different dimensions in which we can categorize this knowledge and content. And then we talked about cognitive complexity, which is related to the type of knowledge and is related, no doubt, to the ability of cognition. But thinking about only that of those things for the analysis, we also have to think about how it transits in the journey of a university student. They have the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th year of their career, or the 5th year if it's a kind of traditional amount of years in Chile, at least. Maybe in Latin America is 5 years regarding professional formation, and maybe the first years we work. If you think about in Brenner as a theoretical theorist, and talks about the context. First, your first years, you're probably capable of seeing different amount of variables. A difference that when at the end of the year, your career, the different variables you are capable of being and complexity that you are able to understand. So then we can put it in 3 different levels to also put it into 5 levels instead of having it. I'm sorry, 3 levels instead of 4 or 5 that solo has, and start with one which is unistructural, one structure, which can be microanalytical, meso, but only one. Then you have the multi-structural, where at least we have 2 contexts in analysis, and we have an interstructural when we have more than 2 or 3 contexts, we could say, of analysis, or at least 3 to be able to resolve or tackle a certain area. And we have the other dimension that could characterize this result of learning, which has to do with cognitive involvement. And we have this ECAP model, which is pretty attractive, that has to do with the interactive, constructive, the active, and the passive, also related evidently with the abilities of different thoughts before described, because if I'm in a level of cognitive ability of transference, then I have involvement that is different and higher than if I am in a level of thinking process of memorization. So I tried to find images that could show what many times we have reflected. And we also think about 3 levels, thinking about things that are to make it manageable for teachers to have these different dimensions and be able to characterize the results of learning. We have a first level where we could say that we find something more passive having to do with learning. What does it mean that it means passive? You could say, you could go to the traditional authors having with the theories of learning, where a student learns by conditioning, or people learn by classical conditioning, receiving and storing information without giving an added value to that information, because the only thing I have to do is repeat literally those things that are in the learning results. It has also been characterized even as reciting. So you can see an image where the brain is being filled up. I remember this image. In some of the presentations previously, there was a similar image of this idea that the brain, our mind, our capability, cognitive capability is filled with information through, and I saw this on one of the other speakers, and they were basically filling a liquid into the brain of the students. And evidently there, what the student needs to do is remember where they saw, where they read, where they heard something, and repeat it the same way they heard, read, or saw it. To name the 3 parts of a neuron, this, and that. It's as if it's not a part of us. We basically receive and give back. It's a self-reflex. I can give you the information just in case you ask me about it. But if we have a second level of active learning, that information enters our organism. We incorporate it, internalize it. We internalize it, but at the same time, when we have to give something regarding that, we give something about ourselves, because we have to have it integrated. We have to rebuild it. We have to construct it. So it involves us as a person in that act of responding a result at that level. Or an input. So here we have the individual differences. You have students who come with cultural capital. You have those who have different study habits. Others have thinking patterns. In countries like ours in Latin America, we start from an education system that is segregated and different for all of our students. And they have higher abilities to be able to carry that exercise out. But there's others who do not come with that background, and they have learned their cognitive capability is basically just to recite. And then we have a last level for us to make it more manageable, which is co-constructive, where we want our students to innovate. And if we had to put a level of presence of the cognitive subject, this is the highest because this is where the student is not only integrated, but he builds something new. This is so they have a higher presence of the student in this. So here you can see a different way to understand and characterize the result having to do with cognitive involvement. And here we are also thinking about solo, but this is also trying to go to that part of think that talks about self-knowledge and other dimensions, and to learn, which is at different levels of characterization of those things that result requires. How can we measure, how can we find something we can measure? Because it's not just in the competences of valuing something. Sometimes it's so hard to say, I don't know if somebody values this or not. We do not know how to measure this in something that is in an objective way, that is a fair in assessment. So thinking about that, also thinking in 3 levels, those levels that we can handle or that we can differentiate better when we're talking about didactics, but we're thinking in 3 levels. You have the linear thinking, you have reversible thinking, and you also have self-regulated thinking. When we talk about linear, it has to do with this thought that is more rigid, polarized, not flexible. Many times you have it's basically a newbie learning, basically, in things that are more polar, that you can distinguish black from white. But when you start developing a deeper comprehension, then you can see the gray areas or more colors and certain contents. And then we also have the reversible. Let me know how much I'm missing, because when I have the presentation in front of me, I can't see the time. So please let me know how I'm doing on time. But reversible thinking is in somehow we want the students to be able to, so that this knowledge can go and come back and not necessarily be different. We can reflect around the knowledge. We can work and manipulate this knowledge to be able to reach something new. And finally, here the knowledge allows us also not only to work cognitively, but also have an impact on ourselves, which is it allows us to self-regulate. And there we can see everything having to do with critical thinking, with self-evaluation, and those things that not only are useful to resolve them on a test or to be able to pass a subject, but it has to do with what stays, what is donated to the person, and that they can use it. And they can use it later on. And this is in the sense of superior thinking, where we can then advance into new learnings. You have 5 minutes left. So the proposal that this presentation has is to see these different results from these analysis and characterization views, and to see these from the process of thinking, from the kind of knowledge, from the cognitive complexity, from cognitive involvement, and also from thinking maturity. It doesn't mean, like everything in life, that we separate it in didactic terms, but this is then given at the same time. When you have a way of thinking, if you have analytical, it's going to be useful to have this thought to be able to analyze certain type of knowledge. Maybe the knowledge having to do with data is not as necessary for a transference level. But if it is more analytical or memory, for example. So we establish certain relationships between these dimensions to be able to characterize the results that they represent. Now, this characterization is not useful if it doesn't allow us to make decisions as teachers. So I come back to the results of learning results that I mentioned at the beginning. At the beginning, we said it has to do with inferring. This is the base of a pedagogical practice. So think how this learning result would be if it's level 1, according to the process of thinking. to be able to describe or judge the pertinence. How would it be different if the way I teach and evaluate and understand regarding this? So then, guys, this learning result in to be able to like somehow chew this information and think about the activities of assessment and teaching activities are necessary to be able to develop these learning results, and that they can see what the difference is among them, and that way they can be active to be able to interact, interrogate their study programs. So we're going to go to the first one, and it says the results, the learning results, and we think about this red that has to do with a more basic level of describing the main theories, the constructivist theories of school learning, or the other one, deduct the learning theory that is the base of a practice of a determined pedagogical practice. So this emphasis in the way that we can teach and assess learning. So we have the first one, right, which is more basic. Describe the main constructivist theory in school learning. So we can think. In the dimensions, it has a thinking process level 1. It has to do with remembering. It has a kind of knowledge which is conceptual. In the learning theories, we have a complexity that is unistructural because we are only saying something theoretically, reflecting and returning a level of involvement which is passive, and a thinking maturity which is linear. So I put these squares a little bit thinking that from this sheet, to think and characterize this result, this learning result, first we need to ask if we want the students to have a study program of this kind, if it's useful. And we need to decide if what program, or if it's worth for this to be the way that we handle this. It's hard to go advancing in this, that for the results to be more complex and challenging, which is something that we were commenting previously on a different panel. Because if we think about the learning result that comes next, that is much more complex, they're already using that learning. So we need to think about this first box, which is how can we make the children reach, or the students reach, this result that we are wanting? Maybe we have to think about something dialogical, or maybe we need to use some kind of material or study guidelines, or worksheets. And how are we going to assess? And here maybe it would be easier to do some kind of a brief question or multiple choice question, so we can see the result of that learning. But if we have this other result, which says judge the learning theory that is the base of a determined pedagogical practice, we can't teach the same way as the previous one. First, the result is level 3 of transference, the thinking process. We can have a kind of knowledge which is conceptual and procedural. And we have cognitive complexity, which is multi-structural, because first they have to infer what kind of practices are present in a situation, in a X context, and then they have to judge quality or pertinence of that practice to be able to reach certain learning. So there's a relationship between the different things. So there's a relationship. I have to build, I just can't repeat the theories. I have to think about all the different learning theories I know to see which is the one that is there and is being used in practice, by the way they talk, by the way you speak to the students, by the way you build an assessment. And then after inferring which one it is, I have to define if it's the best one according to what the professor wants to accomplish within the students. So on the other hand, when we judge and assess and think a little bit about the standards, the judgment of assessment, then I am also developing the self-regulation. I have one slide left. So evidently here, teaching and assessment is different from the previous one. And we need to make different decisions, because if I only have one class in PowerPoint, spoken, recited, just a talk, and I assess with closed questions, I'm not necessarily going to be able to, or the student is not going to be able to give me evidence that they have reached the results, learning results. So why do I begin the presentation saying that the learning result is like a compass or the center of the process? Because when we are able to analyze and chew and get deeper into what a learning result means in all of its different elements, then we can make better decisions, pedagogically speaking, regarding how we are going to assess, because we are looking at this from the design backward design, to then from this concept of where we are, what we're going to see with Tele in the next presentation. So the results, learning results, the evidence of how we are going to see the learning, so I can see the different strategies of assessment to be able to reach learning or teaching strategies. And that would be it. Thank you very much. I hope that we can continue talking at the end of the presentation. Thank you, Veronica, for this interesting presentation. I think it's very important what you have talked about, and also to check, especially in our higher education system here in Chile. And we continue now with our seminar with Tele Halicari, who is going to share with us how teaching. She is professor and senior lecturer of the University of Pedagogy in the University of Helsinki, where she mainly teaches pedagogical course for university professors. Currently, her research focuses on the well-being of university students and professors, and on the study processes of university students. She is interested in the relationship between the learning processes of university students, experiences of teaching learning environment, and well-being. Her research has shown that the learning processes are strongly related to the ability of students to regulate their learning and emotions, as well as their successes and failures. Welcome, Telly. You can begin.
Thank you very much for this introduction. I will look for my slides here. Yes, so hello everyone. I was supposed to give this presentation with my colleague Viivi Virtanen, but unfortunately she is sick at the moment. But I have transferred my work to Häme University of Applied Sciences for 1 year. So I still work at the University of Helsinki, but currently my main employee is at the Häme University of Applied Sciences. But my topic today has to deal with how teaching and assessment can support students' active learning. And in this presentation, I will focus on how to support students' active learning, and I will first present some central concepts that are related to this topic, and also then some findings of our study where we explored students' perspectives on different elements of constructive alignment and how they support students' active learning. So I will first start by the concept of constructive alignment, which most of you are probably very familiar with, but it is a very central concept in our study, and also when we think of the ways to support student learning. So I will first start by introducing it. So in this concept of constructive alignment, this term constructive refers to the constructivist view of learning. So the student is seen as a very active actor in the learning process. So this constructive in this concept refers to the idea that students actively construct meaning through relevant learning activities. And this is very close to the concept of deep approach to learning that I will talk about a bit later. On the other hand, this term alignment refers to a learning environment where teaching and learning activities and assessment tasks are all aligned to the intended learning outcomes. So this is very familiar, resonates quite well with what Veronica was just talking about in her previous speech. But the idea here is that student is at the center of the teaching learning process, and it is then very central to design the learning so that the students' active learning and deep approach to learning is supported. So here, the central idea by Biggs and Tang is that effective teaching requires that we eliminate those aspects of teaching that encourage surface approach to learning, and that we set stage properly so that students can more readily use deep approach to learning. And this is what I will elaborate a bit more in my next slides. So, as I said, students, this concept of constructive alignment refers to the idea that all the elements of teaching learning environment are aligned and steer the learning to the same direction, which should be students' own deep understanding of the issue that they are about to learn. And it can be seen as consisting of 3 different phases: the planning phase, the teaching and learning activities, and assessment. So in this planning phase, this is exactly what, referring to the previous presentation, the very central step when you start designing teaching and learning is to define the intended learning outcomes. So what are the students supposed to learn and master after they have completed this course? Or you can also look at this at the curriculum level. What are the students supposed to master after they have completed their whole study program? But in this presentation, I will focus on the course level of constructive alignment. And these intended learning outcomes are or should be often defined as actions that students are supposed to bring into play in their learning. And then after this step, all the other steps should be designed so that they support the attainment of these intended learning outcomes. So then, after the intended learning outcomes are defined, it is central to choose appropriate teaching methods and learning activities that support the students to achieve these learning outcomes, and also choose appropriate content and materials that support students' learning. And then finally, and very centrally, it's very important to choose appropriate assessment methods that support the attainment of these intended learning outcomes. So this assessment should be in line with these learning outcomes and support students' learning, and also focus on what the students are supposed to learn in this course. And very central here is also to think about how do students get feedback from their learning, and at what points of the learning process do they get feedback that they can use to develop their own learning. And also, how do teachers get feedback from their own teaching so that they can develop their own learning? I will focus a bit more on this assessment part of the constructive alignment because it is very, very central. And because we know from previous research that students are very sensitive about what will be assessed in the course. And assessment guides students' learning very strongly. So here, this picture is sort of an illustration of the teachers' and students' perspectives and differences between these different perspectives. So teachers are often, when they start thinking about the teaching learning process, they are often very much concerned about the objectives and goals of the course. So what are the students supposed to learn in this course? And then choose the appropriate teaching methods and assess these objectives and goals. But when we look at the student perspective, students often start to look at the learning process from the assessment point of view. So students have many courses to pass, and they need to be sort of strategic also in their learning. And they start thinking, what do I need to do in order to pass this course and in order to attain the learning outcomes? And this starts to guide their learning quite strongly. This has been shown in many research, and also influences the approaches to learning they adopt, and finally their learning results. So if there is misalignment between these intended learning outcomes of the course and the assessment of the course, then there are problems, because if these are not aligned, students' learning process starts to go in a different direction than what the teacher was intending to do. And this has also been referred to as a backwash effect of assessment, because assessment sort of forms a hidden curriculum that starts to influence the learning process instead of the stated objectives. So here you are probably very familiar also with this concept of approaches to learning, but I will also shortly present them to those who are not so familiar with those. So as I said, the aim of constructive aligned teaching is to support students' deep approach to learning. And there's a long tradition to conceptualize students' learning processes, especially in higher education, through these concepts of approaches to learning. And so in these approaches to learning describe the students' learning processes that they apply to achieve the aims of the course or their own aims. And previous research has identified 3 different approaches to learning: deep reflective approach, surface or unreflective approach, and organized studying. And this organized studying is a bit different from these two other approaches, and it more describes the approach to studying that the student is using to achieve their aims. So it's sort of like time and effort management, and how they organize their own resources and learning. But this is not the focus here so much, but I will more elaborate on this deep or reflective approach to learning. So this deep approach to learning is characterized by an intention to understand and maximize own understanding. And to achieve this, students use a variety of different learning processes, such as relating and analyzing information and reflecting on different concepts and their relations, and trying to form a sort of coherent understanding of the interrelations, for example, between concepts, and doing comparisons and so on. And this is usually based on a personal interest in the subject matter, and usually this sort of learning process results in coherent knowledge base. And on the other hand, surface or unreflective approach, that it's called nowadays more as an unreflective approach or conceptualized, it is more typical for this surface approach to learning is the sort of intention to cope with the course requirements, and then to sort of learn facts to pass the course. And so then the learning here focuses more on facts and like separate facts, instead of forming a coherent understanding of the topic that is being learned. And usually for this surface approach to learning, this unreflective studying is very, very typical. So students who adopt this surface approach to learning, they don't typically assess their own learning or critically think about different things, but rather they focus on, as I said, separate facts, and this usually typically results in a fragmented knowledge base. And with this approach, it is usually related also to an experience of high workload, because the human's capacity to sort of memorize or understand separate facts is very limited. And so this is usually also typical for students who don't yet know how to study in another way. So these are sort of can be seen as sort of very different sort of learning processes that the students might adopt, and also they are very context specific. So it might be that in one course a student adopts a deep or reflective approach to learning if they are very interested in the issue, and then in another course they might resort more in this surface approach to learning. But we also know that this unreflective approach to learning is more stable, and if the student doesn't know how to sort of doesn't have very good study skills, they might adopt this approach. So regarding these concepts that I was just introducing, we were interested in our study to think about this principle of constructive alignment that we often teach in our courses as a way to support students quality learning and teaching. But surprisingly, there is quite little empirical evidence of this theoretical model and how different elements of the constructive alignment actually influence the students' actions and the approaches to learning, and especially from the students' point of view. So how students experience these things. So this resulted in our study that has been published in Active Learning in Higher Education. So if you are interested, you can read more about it in this in that journal. But we started interviewing students to explore the relationship between elements of constructive alignment. So the elements that I was just introducing, the objectives, teaching and learning activities, and assessment, and how these are related to students' approaches to learning in a course. So here, as I just said, we first looked at the interview data, how students describe their experiences of these different elements of constructive alignment, and then how they are related to the approach to learning they adopt in a specific course. And we interviewed 37 students from 3 different courses, and we had a very rich interview data. And in this interview, we asked very broad questions about the students' experiences and perceptions of the course, but also about their how they went about their studying, and what did they do to study, and what influenced their learning. And then we analyzed this data using qualitative content analysis. And we started firstly by analyzing these students' approaches, and we used this as a framework, these conceptualizations of deep and surface approach to learning that I was previously presenting. So here you can see the 3 courses that were selected for this study. So this first course was a biochemistry course where we interviewed 19 students. And here you can see some descriptors of these courses, but it was quite traditional course with lecturing. So the teachers were presenting and giving lectures. There were occasional short discussions, but also some practical sessions where the students were doing some small practice tasks. And then in the end of the course, there was a written exam. Then there was another course, theology, which was very different in nature, and it applied a flipped learning approach. So the students were reading preparatory reading assignments prior to coming to the lecture. And then in the lectures, they were discussing about these reading assignments and doing tasks related to those. Also, the assessment in this course was very different. There was a drama exam where the students prepared a play about a central theme of the course in small groups. Then there was a third course also from theology, which was again a bit more traditional, focusing more on teachers' lectures and some discussions. And then there were some essay groups and a written exam at the end of the course. So these courses 1 and 3 sort of represented quite traditional courses, whereas this course 2 was a bit different from those. So here I will describe a bit more these different courses, but so with this when we looked at the student interviews, the intended learning outcomes, students were not very aware. They didn't remember what were the intended learning outcomes with the students, and they said that they were not even shared with the students. Also, in these courses, there were very little engaging activities. So the studying for the students were mainly describing that they did the activities that were obligatory to pass this course. However, many students appreciated the quality of teaching, and they praised that the teacher was very enthusiastic in this course. But when we talked about the assessment, or they were describing that they said that it was the assessment, the written exam, that was mainly guiding their learning. So they were mainly focusing on studying for the exam. And when we looked at the students' combined these descriptions of these courses to their approaches to learning. In this course, most students adopted unreflective approach to learning. There were some students who also described some deep approach to learning also, but mainly students in these courses adopted unreflective approach. Here is one extract from the interview. So there's two students describing their learning. First one says that now in this biomolecule course, it happened so that I didn't really do any of the activities because they were not obligatory. The other student said that, well, when you study that kind of trivia, in order to remember it still in the exam, the last few days before the exam are the most important. So here you can see how strongly the assessment is driving these students' learning. Then when we come to this course 2, where which was quite different in nature, so it was a flipped classroom with drama exam. Also, the students did not talk in their interviews much about the objectives, but more about what they had achieved in this course. But when they talked about what influenced their learning was that they described a lot about these teaching and learning activities. And they said that they were teaching and learning activities that required students' active involvement throughout the course. And also the peer group discussions were also very often mentioned. And they were experienced as emphasizing their learning. Also, they very often described that these expectations of assessment guided their actions. So they had this drama exam, and they felt like this was something that was still a learning experience for them, that they had to prepare a drama, and this supported their learning very much. And then when we looked at the students' descriptions of their approaches to learning in these courses, most students, or if I remember correctly, all of the students adopted a deep approach to learning in this course. And here is one interview example. So personally, this suits me really well, and I learned really well with this technique. First, I acquainted myself with the subject a little bit, and then it was handled together. And also it was handled in a group, so you heard so many different points of view and how different people had interpreted the same text so differently. And so you went really deeply into the topic. So this describes quite a different learning process here, where the students and teachers are active in the learning process and not only studying for the final exam as in the previous course example that I gave. Then finally the third course, which was quite similar to course 1. So there's also in this course, the students were not aware of the given objectives of the course, so the intended learning outcomes. But also when they described the teaching and learning activities in these courses, they also said that there were quite little engaging activities, and the studying was driven by the activities that were obligatory to pass the course. And one very characteristic for this course was the students described lack of challenges that had a negative effect on their learning, that they only put very little effort into studying because there were no challenges in this course. Also, they described that the quality of the course materials was not very good, but they still appreciated the quality of teaching and praised the teachers' enthusiasm. But what was typical for this course also was that there was a lack of transparency of assessment. So they did not really know how and what was being assessed in the written exam. So this sort of also caused confusion with these students. And in this course, most students adopted the unreflective approach to learning. So here is an example of a lack of challenges and also lack of challenges related to the assessment. So one student describes here, they had told us that there is no reason to worry about it, that it's like you have been in the classes, so you will pass it for sure. So I took it really casually and just read through the materials. However, I will come, as I said, in the first course, where most of the students adopted an unreflective approach, there was still a group of students who were guided by their own aims. So they did not, there was a group of students who weren't sort of steered by the assessment or the teaching of the course, but rather about their own aims or own intention to learn. So this was especially true for students who adopted the deep approach to learning in the first course. So typical for these students was that these students had their own aims and willingness to put effort into studying. So the teaching itself did not guide or require learning activities a lot, but still these students were guiding their own learning because they were very interested and also had their own aim to get high grades. So as a conclusion from this study or sort of study based on these three cases, in our studies, these learning objectives or intended learning outcomes did not so much have influence on student learning. So in this interview, students were not very much concerned about these objectives, and maybe these were not even very clearly visible to the students, but it was not the thing that was guiding their learning. But maybe if the teacher sort of presented these and made them more visible, maybe the situation would have been different. But again, if these objectives were more manifested in the teaching and learning activities and assessment in these courses, so they had that sort of influence there. But also, what we can conclude from this is that in this study, of course, it's quite small and it only had 3 courses, but in this study, it was quite evident that teaching and assessment guided student learning quite strongly, and especially maybe for students who would otherwise adopt a surface approach to learning. So what we can conclude here is more that teaching that sort of provides enough challenges and requires active involvement throughout the course is also supporting students' learning. So it is sort of forcing students to do learning activities in this course. And because teaching in the more traditionally organized courses that required very little active involvement from the students, it also provides more options for students not to engage. So, based on this study, it appears that how the teaching is organized, it plays a very crucial role in guiding what the students actually do. So sort of it is possible when you design teaching and learning in a way that sort of, as I said, enforces students to engage. That was evident in our study. But also one last important point is that to think about the appropriate level of challenges. So student learning and engagement can be supported with the appropriate level of challenges. And also vice versa, if these challenges are lacking, they might be detrimental to learning. So then they don't engage. If there is not enough challenges, the students are not engaged in learning and learning processes. So as a conclusion, constructively aligned teaching, including activating teaching and assessment methods, can especially support students who would adopt an unreflective approach to learning if they are not actively supported and encouraged to take an active role. So this is one last remark that I will conclude here, and I will be happy to discuss this with you now that we have a mutual discussion session. So thank you.
Muchas gracias, Tele, por mostrarnos cómo son estos patrones de...
Thank you very much, Tele, for letting us know about the teaching and the learning patterns of our students. Thank you. Let me start with questions. This question goes for you, Dr. Margaret Price. It goes, thank you for your presentation. Would you please tell us about some research in higher education in which exemplars have been used to communicate standards to students in a successful manner? Thank you.
Okay. I told you a little bit about the work that we did at Oxford Brookes, where it's important for the students to work with exemplars so that they can see examples of work, and they can then think about how that work relates to the criteria that they've been told is being used to mark that work. They then, once they've made individual decisions, they need then to talk both with other students about the decisions that they've individually made, but also talk to staff. So in other words, building that disciplinary community around both staff and students. And although exemplars, sometimes staff are a bit wary of giving students exemplars because they think they'll copy them. This actually doesn't happen. It's about they use them as sort of sometimes templates, but not in terms of the content. And so after there's been this discussion around the exemplars with the students, that is then allows them to approach new pieces of assessment. And that has been shown, if they have participated in the discussions around the criteria and the level descriptors with an exemplar, that they actually do better, that there's statistical results in relation to that they do better both immediately and in the long term. So that is written up in a piece of work published in Assessment and Evaluation in 2003 by Rust, Price and O'Donovan. Is that okay?
Sí, muchas gracias, Margaret.
Thank you, Margaret. Let us continue with our questions. The second question was triggered thanks to Veronica's presentations. So this question goes to Veronica, but I think this question can be answered by each one of you. And it has to do with how we can do it so that students can prove concrete actions of learning if they have already spent 2 years in a pandemic. I'm guessing the person meant the multi-dimensional aspect of learning outcomes in times of online classes.
Evidentemente es muy contingente.
Thank you for this question. It is very relevant and it addresses everyone's needs, especially in higher education in times of pandemic. And I believe we need to focus on two things, and I'll address this question in prior panels. We have to make a distinction. There are certain things we can assess learning and learning outcomes by putting students in problems, by providing them with realistic context, and we make them face a challenge. And those activities can be performed either on-site or online. As long as we have instruments, methodologies, and a diversity of activities to make them prove their learning outcomes. So you can monitor orally whether they have understood, or you can perform a case analysis with them, or you can analyze different data that are relevant for a subject. In my case, I believe there are several aspects that this pandemic has generated problems with, such as emotions management, sometimes complexity when it comes to relating to one another, since most cameras are off. I believe we can develop a cognitive performance. There are certain study programs, especially for those students in third, fourth, or fifth year, in which students should perform an interview or should perform a diagnosis. We used to do role-playing simulation, and that is now more complex. As of now, those or such activities are easier to do on site. And I've had to talk to research directors that have discovered that certain fields have been severely harmed by the pandemic, especially in the practice of certain professions. And all of us hope this can be improved. Probably once we go back into the classroom, we will have to perform extra sessions to reinforce or to strengthen many of these activities that were left aside because of the pandemic. In many study programs, experience-related learning or internships have been performed online. Interviews have been performed online, among many other things, but there's a huge complexity because sometimes those activities or those skills need to be practiced. We can remain silent with our microphones off and with our cameras off and observe activities such as interviews. In the past, internship or practica supervisors could not be present observing certain things such as interviews. And I believe, well, the technology has opened certain doors, and out of this diversity, we should make the most out of it so that we can propose students or so that we can provide students with high levels of commitment anyway. Margaret, is there anything you would like to mention as well in this regard?
I think I support absolutely what Veronica has said. I mean, I think even in traditional teaching situations, sometimes we're too constrained by the types of assessment that have gone before, and feel that, I mean, there is a belief and there's research about this, that people think the traditional forms of assessment are the most reliable, but there's no real evidence about that at all. There's no real evidence that, for example, exams provide more consistent, fair results than something that's more innovative. And as Veronica says, we have to look at the new the technology that we're now working with and think about, well, do we ask students to make videos if they're rather than a role play? Do we ask them to make PowerPoint presentations, all sorts of different things that perhaps we wouldn't normally do, but it is offering new opportunities as well as constraining us, I think.
Muchas gracias, Margaret.
Thank you, Margaret. What about you, Tele? Is there a comment?
Oh, well,
you would
there's
like to
nothing
make?
much. There's nothing much to add. I totally agree with what Margaret and Veronica were saying, that there are opportunities and challenges present, and as long as we are in this situation, I think we have to try to focus on the opportunities that are possible.
Muchas gracias. Bueno, la siguiente pregunta es
Thank you.
negativa por la presentación.
So the next question goes to Tele, and this question has been repeated in certain manners. More than one person has made the following question. Can you please provide us with ideas on how to help students develop a more reflective approach in regard to their learning? What strategies can students use to get to a higher or deeper learning, or what strategies can teachers use so that tacit knowledge can be shared with one another in the classroom? All of these questions point to the fact that people are asking themselves how professors can promote a reflective approach to learning in students.
Well, I think that is a very good and relevant questions. If I look at it from the point of view, from my presentation, what I was just referring to, so the concept of constructive alignment, I think a lot can be done by designing the teaching and learning and also assessment, so that the students sort of don't have a chance to pass these courses through memorization or through not forming an own understanding of the issue. So I think that by constructing learning activities that require students to actively start thinking and not only producing what the teacher, for example, has said, but something that they have to use their own knowledge and integrate it and solve problems and maybe use the learned things in a novel way and apply it to different settings. I think by designing these sort of tasks and these sort of assessments, I think it is possible to support students to adopt a deep approach to learning, because I think, as I said, there is a small group of students who would do that anyway, but for students for whom it is difficult to sort of start reflecting and analyzing and integrating, if they are not sort of required to do that, it gives them more opportunities to stay passive and not engage in deep learning activities. So I would say that the teacher has a has a very good role in this, what they can do, and it's all about how you design the teaching and learning activities in the course.
Muy de acuerdo, Tele. La siguiente
We
pregunta
agree.
va a continuar en la línea
Next question
de las prácticas que deben implementar los profesores, ¿no es cierto?
goes to the, next question is about the practices to be implemented by professors. And this question is addressed to Margaret. And it has to do with exemplars for students, but the person asking is saying the following thing. It should be a normal thing for professors to calibrate standards and to share exemplars, not only with students, but with one another. Now, how could this be managed? And how could this be managed in institutions having over 50 professors or teachers, for instance?
Yeah, you've identified one of the big challenges with this. In initial stages, it's a good idea to try to calibrate with the people you work closest with, but there does need to be more sort of formal events, if you like, to support calibration among larger numbers of staff. And I think one of the other important things is for us to think about how we integrate new academics into our communities, because I think in the past we've just assumed that they will come on board and use the same standards. Well, I say the same standards that everyone else has, but they will adopt their own standards and that will be fine. But we now know that that is not fine. It's not fine for every individual academic to choose, if you like, these standards that they use. And so I would say it's a requirement to engage in a sort of formal calibration activity, say once a year. I have to say, whenever we have run these things, the people that come feel it is a really, really rewarding experience, and they find it very, very interesting to find out what their colleagues have got to say about these things. So yeah, large numbers are problematic. We have been doing it here across the nation, trying to get people from the same discipline but different institutions to actually come together and talk to each other. It's quite a lot of work and it takes quite a lot of their time, but they, as I say, they have found it rewarding. Okay.
Gracias, Margaret.
Thank you, Margaret. I don't know if you know the work of Mark Freeman in Australia, who also works calibrating standards with teachers from the economy area. It's very interesting to learn about that and implement that in the different faculties. Veronica wanted to comment something regarding what you were saying. Yes, in reality, it's a question also for Margaret, because as experience that I have as faculty, many times the final exams, you have a lot of teachers involved from different areas. The final examination. To be able to calibrate the judgment, the teachers get together beforehand to see the case and somehow reinterpret the rubric, and they talk about that. And there is like a certain script regarding the results, the learning results the teachers should be able to find in that final presentation or that final exam. But many times what happens when this final exam or presentation comes up, you have researchers, you have teachers that have been around for a long time, and many times they feel like you are telling them that you're telling them what to do, so to say, that you are limiting what they can ask and they resist and they say, what's the value of the teacher then in this context? It seems like I might as well just ask a newbie to check this, because if I can't ask questions, things that show up in the exam that sometimes are not so aligned with the exam, then they feel restricted. They feel like they are being limited. And from pre-graduate, we try to explain that all students have to have an experience of the similar experience in their final examination, it not mattering who the teachers are going to be assessing, because some will be more complex than others, and you can't punish one performance because as how do you control the teacher, the questions? How can you balance the freedom of the teachers as well as the freedom or the justice of the assessment for those students that are going through similar processes, especially when it's with different commissions of teachers? The exams have to do with different areas, different subjects, and to try to have that justice. But many times you still have this conflict, so to say. I don't know how to say it with these faculty teams.
Thank you, Veronica. Yeah, I have met this myself. I think there is research around that says that more experienced markers quite often go off at tangents more than new markers do. So in other words, they use criteria that don't appear on the marking rubric, and they have certain things that they are more likely to reward than others. And the idea that they feel constrained, it depends on how it's approached. I mean, I mentioned the degree standards project that I've been working on here in the UK, and it's been about, we have a system called of external examiners, but we've been working with external examiners who are responsible for going in and looking at the standards that are used on courses. And before we get them to engage in calibration, we take them through all the research that shows that there is a lack of consistency between academics, both advanced academics or experienced academics, as well as newbie academics. And so they then begin to own the problem, because they need to own the problem that there lacks consistency rather than just defending their individual views. And remember what I said about the standards being socially constructed. I mean, they are part of that social construction along with all their colleagues. So as long as they feel that they've had a part in that, then their resistance begins to break down. And I'm really glad to hear you say about having that meeting before the assessment takes place, not only about talking about what the rubric means, but again, if there can be some exemplars from previous years where they can really have meaningful conversations about what they would look for in those particular pieces of work, then again, the likelihood of discrepancy is reduced. It certainly doesn't go away, but the likelihood of difference in the final process of agreeing all those large numbers of exams, it does tend to be reduced. So yeah, it's a big problem, but it's the way you approach it.
Muchas gracias. La pregunta de Verónica tenía que ver
Thank you
más
very much. And Veronica's question also has to do with the calibration within the faculty, but the next question has to do with the integration and calibration within the discipline. So I would like to know if, for example, in UK, do you have a system that allows you to calibrate between the professionals and the students of the same discipline, but from other universities? Because there is every university has its own stamp, but there's certain standards or thresholds that you have to accomplish according to each discipline. At least here in Chile, that's very difficult because the universities have more free models, and many times more competition amongst the universities, not necessarily the same standards nor the same thresholds for the same reason. So I would like to know, how is that in England? And if there is any other good example that you could share with us to think at some point to maybe start heading in that direction.
Okay, I mean, we do have a slightly different system in the UK, in as much as we in theory, have one national standard that all universities adhere to, but that doesn't mean each university is very different. They might teach different things in different ways. But as I mentioned, we also have a system called external examining, which is supposed to be a peer-run system whereby someone, for every course in the whole country, there is someone who comes from outside the institution, from the same discipline, but outside the institution, and looks at the grading that has been done by those course teams, and then comments on it, and can advise the institution about whether they think what's going on in that discipline is appropriate. So we do have quite a different system from many other countries. I've now forgotten the rest of your question. It was about the ways in which, sorry, can you remind me what the question was?
Basically, if there's any strategies that allow within the discipline in different universities to have a similar graduality of the criteria.
Okay, thank you. Yes, well, we do, as I say, we do have the external examining system, but it's in its infancy. But there is now this, I think it's been done with about 5-6 different disciplines in the UK, whereby the calibration events are actually run. And so people from different universities are coming together to look and try to calibrate their standards that they have been using. But it is very much in its infancy, and it hasn't as yet been evaluated.
Muchas gracias, Margaret. Y ahora una pregunta.
Thank you very much, Margaret. And now a question for Telly. It's a question that is very specific. And the person wants to know is, what importance do you give to the educational environment and situation circumstances in the constructive learning, according to Fink in his model? For example, how many students are there in the course? If it's postgraduate or pre-graduate, how the course is given, if it's in online or online, if it's live or hybrid, etc.
So if I understood the question correctly, is what importance do I give to the environment and the level? Yeah. Well, I think that if I again think about the from the constructive alignment point of view, I don't think it sort of makes a difference whether it's a small course or whether it's a graduate course or postgraduate course. I think it's still possible to design it in a constructively aligned way, and in a way that it supports students' deep learning and deep understanding. Of course, it's more difficult with some, for example, online or with very large groups of students. But I think still it is possible to do that also in those to design teaching in a constructively aligned way in those sort of situations as well, because I think you can always support, even in large lectures or online, you can still design teaching and activities in a way that it makes students think and trying to form their own understanding. So I think it, of course, it plays a role, but still I think constructive alignment is a sort of cutting theme that you can use in sort of any situation. That's my point of view.
Muchas gracias, Tele. Les pido disculpas porque acá tengo un
Thank you very
perrito.
much, Tele. I apologize. I have a dog barking nearby, but I think you can hear my voice. The next question is for Veronica. It has to do with an example that she presented related to the results, learning results, where the person comments that they thought it was a very interesting, but also there was a confusion that she would like or he would like to clarify. Due to the level of specificity, it also seems to be an activity that the student has to carry out. Therefore, how can they distinguish clearly a learning result from an activity that promotes learning? What aspects should we pay attention to be able to differentiate them? This is not all black and white. This is a pretty gray area in some occasions, in the sense that on one hand, you want something that to be measurable. You want results to be measured, be able to and it has to have these different areas. But on one hand, the learning results are very broad, and then you don't imagine how the student thinks that this is going to be assessed. Or on the other hand, it's very specific, so they might think that it's more like a task or an activity. But the result somehow is between an objective of learning, the view of the teacher, the result, thinking a little bit about what the teacher, the student is going to demonstrate, and maybe there's something smaller, which is the assessment indicator, which sometimes is used more than other. And thinking in those three levels, those different, you probably have this in the middle, where you need to be specific, you need to be measurable. It has to be something you can operate, it has to be operational. And you have to be able to show what the student is capable of doing. It's different to say, for example, at the beginning, when I had to work with teachers years ago, sometimes the teachers would have results, learning results, like comparing on a file the two theories of learning related to the level of activity of the subject that you know. And then we realize that that result sometimes is very specific because it is asking a specific question about for example, a test. So when we are saying that it's a broader level that we are using, we're talking about a verb like analyze, the theories, learning theories, or that they're at the base of a certain practice, I think that is an intermediate learning result, because there's different ways of assessing and different indicators of seeing those learning results. However, I have built these learning results for my program. I'm coordinator of my faculty, and I have worked with the construction of programs in this area. And even there, when I see the results that were the previous year curriculum, for example, I always think they can improve. And I say, why did we write it like that? Why did we say it like that? We could have done it different. We could have specified it differently. I think it's something that is constantly has opportunities to be improving, and we have to be constantly reflecting what is the important thing students need to learn? How can we differentiate? What is the priority? If we are assessing what really matters or not, there's always something that we need to reflect on and has a space for improvement. Thank you very much, Veronica. And now we will be able to end the seminar for today. Thank you so much to the panelists. I would like to thank the audience also who have been in this event today. So panel 7 is now ending, and we invite you to participate tomorrow in feedback experiences and practices in panel 8, which we will carry out tomorrow, December 1st at 1800 hours Chilean time. And the panel 9, feedback to maintain learning, which is also carried out tomorrow at 6:30 p.m. Chile time, right after the first one. It's going to be a long afternoon tomorrow, but it's going to be very interesting. So I hope each of you can come and be with us tomorrow as well. So we will see you tomorrow. Thank you. See you later.
Chao,
Thank you,
Margarita.
bye.
Muchas gracias.
Adiós, Tele y Margaret. Adiós, Verónica. Adiós a
Thank
todos
you.
y todas.
Thank you.